1,000 hours, 41.67 days, 60,000 minutes and 3.6 million seconds, or however you want to put it, is how long I've spent playing EU4. In that time I could have been running businesses,
work it baby, work it,
making videos or carrying the boats Goggin style.
Good, 22!
Who's gonna carry the boats and the logs?
But instead, I decided for years and years to dedicate 1,000 of my precious hours to being cooped up in a squat, choosing the best South American real estate to colonize. And I regret nothing. You see, Europa Universalis 4, the fourth title in the legendary Europa Universalis series, is the greatest grand strategy game of all time, bar none. And I'm here to convince you why. Greatness in any medium is very difficult to define, is what I said when I was questioned on my empty CV.
I'm a very stable genius.
But it also applies to gaming as well. On a basic level, greatness implies excellence in some way. But how to define this excellence is an altogether more difficult question. You see, we all value different things in different types of games for different reasons. Someone might love grand strategy for the maps, others the conquest. And ultimately, there's no way of reconciling this, I'll be honest. If my definition doesn't meet your definition, I guess we'll have to go our separate ways. But to me, the most rigorous way to judge whether a game rises above its peers or not is to what extent it lives up to the foundational promise of the genre it sits within. In other words, how close is it to the ideal grand strategy experience? So what is that? What's the unique selling point of a grand strategy game? Well, I believe the easiest way to find this out is to go back to the beginning, specifically 1983. Now, 1983 is known for many things. It was a time when you didn't have to sell an organ to buy a house, and Donald Trump was just an eccentric real estate developer. But it was also when an entire genre was virtually created overnight by a single release: Strategic Simulations Geopolitic 1990. Strategy games, nor titles with unnecessarily French names, were nothing new either in analog or computer form. But what made Geopolitic so different, so distinct and so fresh was its bold new ambition. You see, Geopolitic didn't just want to provide players with a compelling strategic experience, but to actively simulate the complex, messy world of global politics. You play the leader of a nation, and much like a real leader, your success or failure is far more dependent on your ability to manage resources, anticipate outcomes, and navigate complex diplomatic and trade relationships than anything else. Now, as you'd expect from a game released in 1983, a time when typing was a groundbreaking innovation.
The most exciting thing I find is the mailbox.
The substance of Geopolitic doesn't quite hold up to the weight of its ambition, nor the pretension of its French name. A computer with the processing power of a malfunctioning toaster simply didn't have the ability to simulate the complexity of geopolitics. But the formula it introduced and the vision it failed to achieve would act as the foundation and aspiration for the genre, from the Crusader Kings series to Stellaris to everyone's favourite bookkeeping simulator, Victoria, to the Total War hybrid model. Every grand strategy since has attempted to simulate the dynamics that underlie politics on a grand scale, to demystify an otherwise shrouded realm. Therefore, to me, the ultimate grand strategy is the one that is most able to achieve this reality, to really put players in the shoes of a leader. So why have I picked EU4? Well, it all comes down to a flaw in the Geopolitic formula that I have not seen any other game navigate quite so well. Something I term the late game curse. This curse emerges from one of the most fundamental features of grand strategy, the reliance on quantification. You see, to represent abstract concepts like strength of an alliance or opinion that don't really have any sort of real world parallel, grand strategy games quantify these concepts so that players can learn how to manage them, without which it will be impossible to simulate the challenges and feeling of managing a geopolitical conflict in a realistic way. But this over-reliance on quantifying that which cannot really be quantified comes with a massive downside as well: difficulty swings. You see, if the difficulty, in other words the strategic element of grand strategy, is dependent on our understanding of how to manage these quantities, then as we grow in familiarity with this process, the game will necessarily become easier in the later stages than the earlier one. In other words, there'll be a regression of difficulty. Now, grand strategy devs are very aware of this issue, and so you'll often see a random event come out of nowhere, an invasion like Stellaris, to kind of counter that familiarity. But this fundamentally doesn't address the overall flow of the gameplay. A great case study is Crusader Kings 3. Now, just to make it clear, This is not me saying CK3 is a bad strategy game. Quite the opposite. I've never played a game that on a moment-to-moment basis has quite captured the madly incestuous, petty, and often highly unstable reality of medieval politics, quite like CK3. Most games present the medieval period as either a depressingly grey, boring and disease-ridden cesspot, which also happens to be Joe Biden's gynecology report, or a time of high politics and ideological clashes of civilizations. But in reality, neither represents the full picture. Yes, there were many disease outbreaks, high infant mortality, and life was far more difficult than it is today. But medieval people were also just as full of humour, goofiness, and absurdity as we are. And similarly, while there were dramatic ideological clashes between knights and religious groups like in the Crusades to an extent, most conflict in the medieval period resembled family drama more than a clash of civilizations. The 100 Years' War wasn't a battle between the English nation and the French one, but different sides of the same family tussling over property. And CK3 is the only game, grand strategy or otherwise, that I've seen really put you in this reality. Building your power base is more about setting up the right marriages, seducing the right people,
They know a player.
ensuring your family don't feel like assassinating you, and making sure your nobility just feel heard, than military strategy. But where it goes wrong is that it falls straight into this late game curse. CK3 never really manages to outpace the player's adaptation to its systems. The further you progress, the easier things get, to the point where managing an empire in CK3 is far simpler than a kingdom or dukedom on your first playthrough. And I don't think I need to give you a history lesson for you guys to get this isn't exactly right. Let's take rebellions as an example. Early on, they're a massive threat, when you have no resources and are strikingly vulnerable to foreign invasion. But by the time you control a large kingdom with a large retinue and are flush with cash, you'll realize that putting down or preventing one altogether is just a matter of imprisoning, seducing, and buying your way out of trouble. And the same applies to everything from educating your heirs to arranging marriage and knocking off your enemies. Everything gets significantly easier as you grow, and even a surprise Mongol invasion at the end isn't enough to counter this reality, in my experience. And so by the time you get to the end game, what was once a brilliant simulation becomes a glorified blob builder, with constant quarantine alerts and family troubles. And most grand strategies fall into this trap. They mystify players early on with their complicated mechanics, but fail to evolve with us. And at face value, EU4 isn't any different. In fact, its gameplay loop is even more reliant on understanding how to manage certain fixed mechanics than CK3, because the game is largely just about managing quantities. Unlike the Crusader Kings series, you don't control a character but a nation, and so the entire gameplay loop is based around your ability to manage abstract quantities that represent resources and vague concepts like power, prestige, and stability. And there are so many thrown at you from the beginning that if I explained how they worked, this would turn into a video so convoluted, watching Tenet afterwards would feel like a soothing break from the information overload. So theoretically, EU4 should be far more susceptible to a late game curse. After a period of initial overload, players should be able to adjust, and by the time they get to the late game, play with complete thoughtlessness, just like CK3. And this would be so if not for a brilliant innovation I refer to as context shifting. You see, unlike CK3, where you finish the game as the undisputed master of your personal continent-spanning fiefdom, EU4 progressively throws new challenges and scenarios that force you to constantly reorient how you play and see the game. At the beginning, you're like a newborn, keen to learn and wary of the threats you cannot yet perceive, and so have to learn through blood, sweat, tears, and punishment to barely survive. In the mid-game, you're an adolescent, smug, arrogant, and free, but unequipped to the challenges of adulthood. And in the late game, you're a mature professional, knowledgeable, but plagued by strict limitations. But enough of me talking about EU4. It's much easier for me to delve into my first experience playing EU4 to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. As an Englishman, when I decided to boot up EU4 for the first time, I knew what nation I had to pick and which nation I had to pick off. Sorry France, although not really. It is what it is. But I was shocked to discover that despite what the historical record of British imperial conquest suggested, embarrassing the French and conquering the world wouldn't be a walk in the park. Yes, being Britain held certain advantages even in this pre-colonial era, As a European civilization compared to the civilizations of Asia, Africa and Americas, I was constantly closer to the centers of pre-modern technological innovation. On top of this, I was in a prime position to set up a large naval force and could use this power to extract from the prosperous English Channel. But the shrouding of the world map in a grey fog and limitations on the distance at which I could explore and turn lands far away into my personal core territories initially meant that these advantages didn't mean much. On top of this, I was bombarded with so many numbers and features I could barely understand, even after watching hours of tutorials, what was going on. And this made dealing with the threats that were everywhere especially difficult. Not only were the French knocking at the door ready to avenge losses in the 100 Years' War and take back their land, or my land, but I had to deal with the potential threat of all of the surrounding European powers gathering in a coalition if I decided to take too much territory. Luckily, through sheer trial and error, by which I mean reloading saves, I managed to overcome this. But just as I was beginning to get comfortable with my cozy little slice of Europe I had consolidated, an entirely new possibility for expansion opened, and with it, a source of danger. Of course, I'm referring to colonialism. As this was my first playthrough, I was introduced to it largely through the actions of its earliest adopter, Portugal, not my own. But it didn't take me long to realize the implications. If Portugal and pretty much every remotely competent naval power could sidestep Europe and accumulate tremendous economic and military resources by exploiting far-off lands, they could turn their gold against me. And so I had to entirely shift my strategic mindset and learn EU4 again. Concentrating my resources largely around a small corner of Europe wasn't enough. I had to think on a global scale. And just like the first phase, through trial and error, failure after failure, and liberal use of reloading, I eventually figured out how to do this. I'd conquered parts of Africa, gone into South America, all without losing my base in Europe. More than that, I was thriving. Turns out, the proceeds of colonialism are very lucrative. Who knew? The flow of trade from Africa and South America completely solved my cash flow issues. I was rolling in so much dough that just like Elon Musk, I could devote it to crazy ventures like invading the Ottoman Empire. And it seemed to me that following this, my path to global domination was simply impossible to stop. But guess what? As I was getting comfortable in this scenario, another challenge emerged. This time from a new admin tech level that introduced me to a new building. Furnaces. Now, furnaces might not sound like a revolutionary piece of tech, but as a representative of a new industrial shift in global economic relations, they give anyone who captured them a massive boom, a 5% global production multiplier that's stacked. And they couldn't simply be built anywhere. No, to create a furnace, there had to be latent coal underneath said territory. Luckily as England, I had plenty of resources, but unfortunately I wasn't the only one. These resources were spread all over the world in different territories and continents, and this presented a problem. At this stage, I didn't really need the money, but if my enemies got hold of those resources instead of me, that could present a real problem because of a unique and brilliant feature of EU4 called coring. To cut a long story short, EU4 is set up to give smaller nations a massive inbuilt efficiency bonus. You see, there are two types of territories which you can own in EU4, cores and non-cores. I won't go into the complex details, but cores enable you to access far more of the inbuilt resources of said territory than non-cores. This presents a problem for larger powers because to make a territory a core costs a lot of resources and is limited by a cap that will not scale with the speed of your expansion. So to put it simply, the more you expand, the less efficiently you can maximize the resources you control. So a mid-sized nation with 10% of my financial power might be able to build 25% of my army capacity. So if they all decided to band together, as they will do at this stage, I would be in trouble. Just think of it kind of like this. In the same way that despite his virtually unlimited resources, Elon Musk cannot match up to the power of a Twitch chat. So once again, I had to completely relearn EU4 to figure out how to be everywhere and anywhere at once, not just across a continent or two, and how to effectively utilize mercenaries to scare off attacking armies, given the major limitations I had to my manpower because of the coring system. And so when I finally finished the game, not having completed my conquests, I was still hungry for more. There were so many challenges to undertake, systems to understand, that I'm here 1,000 hours later. But the true genius of EU4 isn't just that it avoided this late game curse, but the way in which it used the history of the period to achieve this. You see, every phrase in EU4 reflects a historical period. In the case of my first playthrough, the early game put me in the shoes of a late medieval English king. I was isolated near a continent full of dangers, with limited resources to go elsewhere, with no choice but to seek my fortune in Ireland and barely anywhere else. When new opportunities like colonialism opened up and I was able to see the possibility to escape this confinement, I began to shift to the perspective of an early modern English monarch, more secure in my territory and continental in my ambition. And as wealth from these ventures began to flow in, I began to shift to the mindset of an 18th to 19th century monarch, obsessed with expanding and dominating every continent as much as possible, invading India, traveling to China, trying to capture every resource I possibly could. And England isn't alone. Whatever nation you pick in EU4 brings with it challenges and limitations that reflect the unique historical narrative of this period. And if this isn't the true essence of grand strategy, distilled to perfection, I don't know what is. And while we're on the topic of things distilled to perfection, if you enjoyed this video and want the algorithm to push it further than just you, please leave a comment, like, and if you're so inclined, subscribe.